Such love, pure as the whitest snow. Such love, weeps for the shame I know.
Okay, welcome. We'll make a start. This is session 3 of our studies in the letter to the Romans. It's part of the Bible-based online Bible school project. And maybe you remember that we said we were going to divide it up into 6 unequal sections. The first one would be an introduction, which we did in the previous 2 sessions. Then starting tonight, we'll start on the second section, which I'm calling guilty. And then the next one will be justified. And then the 4th section will be from death to life. And then the 5th section will be what about Israel? And then the 6th section will be the new life. So I'm going to have a look at this section that I'm calling guilty. And because there's been a little bit of a gap, I'll just remind myself and everyone else that this is where we ended the last session, where Paul says in Romans chapter 1 and verses 16 and 17, this is almost a prologue for the whole of the Romans. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first, and also for the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. I want to draw attention to 2 or 3 passages of Scripture which may seem unrelated to Romans, but I think are really very, very much related to Romans. The first one is in Luke chapter 23. Luke chapter 23, and it's actually part of the trials that the Lord was subjected to on the night that he was arrested. And this is verse 13. I'll just read a couple of verses. Luke 23:13. Then Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, said to them, "You have brought this man to me as one who misleads the people. And indeed, having examined him in your presence, I have found no fault in this man concerning those things of which you accuse him." In fact, that is a very clear expression of the Roman legal procedure. And there are others. That's from Luke. If we go to Acts chapter 26, which of course is also Luke, but this time the Acts. Acts chapter 23 and verse 26. This is the letter that Claudius Lysias, the centurion at the Antonius fortress, sent to Felix to accompany Paul. So I'll read from verse 23. And he called for 2 centurions, saying, "Prepare 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night, and provide mounts to set Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor." He wrote a letter in the following manner: "Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. Coming with the troops, I rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. And when I wanted to know the reason why they accused him, I brought him before their council. I found out that he was accused concerning questions of their law, but had nothing charged against him deserving of death or chains. And when it was told me that the Jews lay in wait for the man, I sent him immediately to you, and also commanded his accusers to state before you the charges against him. Farewell. you can see that from the trial in front of Pilate and this trial that Claudius Lysias had been part of, that there's always this insistence that the accusers are present with the person who is accused when the trial actually begins. And actually, if we go on a little bit farther into this particular story of Paul's trials in chapter 23 and verse 34, it says, "And when the governor had read it, he asked what province he was from, and when he understood that he was from Cilicia, he said, 'I will hear you when your accusers also have come.' And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's praetorium." The point I want to make about this is that the Roman legal procedure was very formal, very strict, and very consistent. And it always had this kind of a pattern, that the people who were bringing the accusation had to bring the accusation in the presence of the person who was being accused, and they all had to be there together. And in fact, this pattern of Roman law that you can see with Christ's trial and Paul's trial, I think is really very significant. Because when you come into the Acts of the Apostles, you're coming into something that might be called the kind of the controlling model. That's to say, Paul is going to use a metaphor, an illustration to convey truth to us. And he's going to use the metaphor of a Roman trial. And he uses it consistently. And I'm personally convinced that the reason we have Pilate's trial of Jesus so meticulously recounted and Paul's trial so meticulously recounted is because it gives us this background for this particular illustration, which is really fundamental to the way that God conveys truth to us. So a Roman trial would start off with an accusation. The accusation would lead to a trial, and then the trial would take place with the accused person and the accuser and the judge, who would be much more like our English magistrates, not with a jury, but just a judge. And then there would be a trial. After the trial had taken place, there would have to be a decision, obviously, and the judge would make that decision. And really, there were just two possible decisions that he could make. He could either judge that the person was guilty of the charge of which he was accused, or that he was, to use the technical word, just. That's almost the equivalent of saying not proven guilty of the crime with which he was accused. So you've got this contrast between guilty or just. These are the only two verdicts that can come out of a Roman court. You've got the accusation, you've got the trial, then you've got the verdict, which is either guilty or just. If it's guilty, and it's the judge who makes this decision, if it's guilty, the next thing to happen is that the judge would then pronounce the sentence. He would pronounce guilt, first of all, but then he would pronounce the sentence, and then ultimately the sentence would be carried out. We call that the execution. If on those last three, the guilty verdict and the sentence and the execution, are what's sometimes called the condemnation, there is a difference in Roman law procedure between the judgment and the condemnation. But it's a distinction that particularly our old King James Version doesn't make very clear to us, so we don't see it. And particularly in some key places in John's Gospel, you've got the word condemnation where really we ought to have the word judgment. And there's really quite a big difference, because the judgment in a sense is the process of judging, whereas condemnation is the end of the process. When the person themselves have actually been found guilty, the sentence has been pronounced and the person is led away to whatever their sentence is. If, on the other hand, the judge decides that there is no evidence to sustain this in the way that Pilate did of Christ and in the way that Claudius Lysias did, in that case they would have to declare that the prisoner was just. If the prisoner was just, that meant he was free instantly. He walked from the court a free man with not a stain on his character. He was absolutely free. This picture then of a Roman court case with its accusation, trial, then the process of judgment, then the decision, guilty, and then moving into the condemnation of the sentence pronounced and then the sentence carried out, or the other option of pronouncing the accused person just and setting him free, is the background to a lot that we're going to get in the next couple of chapters of the letter to the Romans. So try and keep that in your minds if you can. Now, Paul uses this picture, and he is now actually going to conduct his own court case. He is going to be the accuser. And the people who are going to be in the dock as the accused, first of all, will be the heathen world. This is something that you find in the Old Testament. You find it in Jeremiah, you find it in Isaiah, when the prophets take the part of the counsel for the prosecution in the English system. They bring the accusation. The accusation was brought against Israel that they had failed to be the people that God had intended them to be. So Paul is bringing an accusation, but he isn't bringing it primarily here against Israel. He's bringing it against what I would call the heathen world. And he says this in Romans chapter 1, verse 18 and 19. He says this, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them." So in the previous couple of verses, Paul had talked about the gospel being a revelation of the righteousness of God. But now he begins to bring this accusation against the heathen world. And he says actually God's wrath has already been revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth. That's going to be a key point that Paul will make in the next few verses. That what the heathen world has done is that they have actually suppressed the truth. They have refused to believe the truth that God has spoken to them. Because he says what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. And what Paul then goes on to show is that through the natural creation, particularly the stars and the sun and the moon, there has been a revelation of certain aspects of God's character. In the revelation of the stars and the moon, we see God's character, not in its entirety, but we see that there is infinite power there. And we also see that there is divinity, that's to say deity, God's order. So the Bible claims that there is enough of a revelation in God's creation to convince men and women of the fact that God has absolute power and that he has absolute control and that the whole of the universe has come from his hand. That's kind of the picture of it. And Paul goes back to Psalm 19, where you get that same thing, where it says that the sound has gone out to the whole earth and there isn't a single language where it hasn't been heard. I sometimes mischievously say that atheists are people who say they don't believe in God. But that's all right, because God doesn't believe in atheists. And what I mean by that is that God believes there is sufficient in the revelation of his creation for any open-minded man to come to the conclusion that there is behind the creation infinite power and absolute order, deity. For since the creation, this is the verse 20, since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. That's at the end of verse 20. That without excuse kind of shows that Paul is thinking in terms of a legal case. He's using this picture, he's using this controlling model. But that word without excuse is a word anapologetos. An apology in philosophy is not when you say you're sorry for something. It's when you argue your case, where you bring your argument in defense of the position that you hold. That is an apology. This word that's translated without an excuse actually means without an apology, or if you want to put it into a legal term, Paul claims that the whole of the heathen world is without a defense. They have absolutely no excuse for the way that they have lived out their lives, because God has put sufficient evidence in his creation to convince any open-minded man. So it's that word without excuse, and right at the end of this session we'll come across that word without excuse again. Okay, so I want to think about what it is that Paul accuses the heathen world of. He claims that they are culpable. That's a kind of a way of saying that they are worthy of blame. There's a phrase that occasionally you hear people use in films and plays and things, and they say mea culpa, and it actually means I am to blame. It's when someone is accepting responsibility for what they have done. So culpability means someone who is blameworthy. And Paul is speaking to the heathen world here, and he is saying, you are worthy of blame. When someone is worthy of blame, the official word for that is guilty. And this is one of the things that I often come back to. Some people will get tired of me saying this. But when you come across the word guilty in the Bible, it never means a feeling. It never means that you feel badly about something. It's always a judicial decision. It's actually the judge who has tried the case and decided that you are guilty. And because you are guilty, there will now be a condemnation. So Paul is saying that the entire heathen world is guilty. That's to say, they are worthy of blame. They are accountable. There's no excuse. There's no defense of any kind at all. And this is what he says. This is chapter 1 and verse 21. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Paul says they knew God. There was sufficient of God in his creation for them to have acknowledged that God has infinite power and that he has infinite control. But he says here, they didn't glorify him as God, neither were they thankful. I think those two steps are really kind of key. What it's really saying is that people did not give God his rightful place, nor did they have gratitude in their hearts. And in a sense, that's really where the history of our whole race begins, with someone who didn't give God his rightful place and someone who wasn't thankful but wanted things that were forbidden for him in that particular time. And Paul says they became futile in their thoughts. We'll come back to this idea again in a little while. And their foolish hearts were darkened. Something happened to their thinking processes. Something happened so that they were no longer able to think in an absolutely rational way. So now what they need is, if you like, extra revelation from God. He goes on to say in verses 22 and 23 that professing to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man and birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. I always notice when I read that verse how that is a descending order. They made images of God in the form of man, birds, four-footed beasts, creeping things. Some versions actually say reptiles. Just as they sunk lower and lower and lower. And then Paul says this. This is him expressing why the wrath of God has been revealed. He says in verse 24 of chapter 1, therefore God gave them up to uncleanness in the lusts of their heart, to dishonor their bodies among themselves. That word gave them up literally means to hand them over. It literally means to give into the hands of somebody else. And Paul says that because mankind, and particularly the heathen nations, because they rejected the light that God had given to them, because they rejected that revelation of God, God handed them over. He no longer restrained lusts that were in their heart. He no longer restrained their appetites. He just let them go their own way. He abandoned them. In fact, this is the very same word that's used when it talks about the Father delivering up the Son in the cross. He handed him over. It's a very powerful kind of a statement. And in fact, Paul uses this idea 3 times, and you might say that this is the sentence that comes from the judge. In chapter 1 and verse 24, therefore God gave them up to uncleanness in the lusts of their heart, to dishonour their bodies among themselves. Then 2 verses later in verse 26, he says, for this reason God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. And then the 3rd time, in verse 28, he says, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God, the New King James Version, following the Old King James Version, says gave them over, but it's exactly the same word. God gave them up to a debased mind, to do those things which are not fitting, not suitable, not the right things to do. So 3 times it says it, almost like the tolling of a bell. God gave them up. God gave them up. God gave them up. I think what it's saying is that all these 3 abandonments really took place at the same time. I don't think we've got a sequence here. I think we've just got 3 things that happened at the same time. But Paul is hitting the same nail 3 times. God gave them up to uncleanness. He gave them up to vile passions. He gave them up to a debased mind. Really, it's some terrible sentence that has come on the world. That's the work of the judge. It's God who's done that. In chapter 1 and verse 28, I want to have just a little look at this particular sentence here. Even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting. It's this in Young's literal translation, he translates it like this. And according as they did not approve, the New King James Version says like, he says approve. According as they did not approve of having God in knowledge, God gave them up to a disapproved mind to do things not seemly. And maybe if I say that sentence again, you'll see that there's a connection between what they did and what God did. According as they did not approve of having God in knowledge, God gave them up to a disapproved mind. And what Young's literal translation is doing there is it's bringing out the fact that this word that's translated like in the New King James really would be better to be translated something like approve or proof. And I'll give you a little illustration of what's going on here in just a second. In the UK, we have a system where precious metals, if they're made into artifacts of one kind or another, they are what they call hallmarked. They put a mark on them. For example, if you kind of see here my wedding ring, if you could see on the inside of it, there are small marks because this was made in England. One of them will tell you what level of gold there is in it. One will tell you the office where they tested it to find out what gold was in it. Another will tell you possibly the maker who actually made the thing. And this idea of testing something with a view to approving it or providing the proof is actually an idea that goes back into ancient history as well. So you would have metals that were tested, and when they were tested, they were approved. If they were tested and they didn't come up to the standard, then you didn't put the proof mark on them. If they did come up to the standard, you did put the proof mark on them. What Paul is saying here, and it really is, it's a very, very strong statement. he's saying the equivalent of this. He's saying that human beings, the heathen nations, if you like, the whole world, actually put God to the test in their assay office, in their proof office, proved that he was absolutely up to the rate. But pure gold is 24 carat, so that would have the numbers kind of 100 or 0.99 in your wedding ring, but it would be so soft that you wouldn't kind of wear it for very long. So they don't usually work like that. But what they did is that they put God to the test. They saw the evidence of God in the creation. They saw evidence of his infinite power. They saw evidence of his absolute control, and then refused to put their stamp on it. They refused to acknowledge what they had seen. They defied their own consciences. They refused to say yes to what God had plainly made clear to their hearts. When I was a younger man, I worked for about 2 years in the pottery industry. And in those days, occasionally you would have pottery which really looked very good, and you could take it home for just a few pence because it wouldn't have the maker's stamp on the bottom. And what they were what they called seconds. What had happened is that the looker-over, my wife's mother was a looker-over, they would check over the piece of pottery, and if it was perfect, they would then put the manufacturer's stamp on the bottom. The manufacturer is really saying, yes, we certify that this is a good product from Wedgwood's or Dalton's or wherever it is, and we're pleased to put our mark on this. If it wasn't up to their perfect standard, they wouldn't put the mark on it. So it would look pretty good for most people, but it just wouldn't have the Wedgwood's or the Dalton's stamp on it, simply because it hadn't been proven in that sense. Paul is saying that what happened here is that God revealed himself to men and women, made it absolutely crystal clear, and they refused to acknowledge it. They refused to recognize what God was plainly saying. Really what they did is they refused to recognize God's authority. It's almost as though it's like an ambassador. He goes to another country and he has to be recognized by that country. If he's not recognized, then he can't do his job. They saw God's revelation in his creation. They saw it in the scripture, but they refused to recognize simply because they wanted to be free to live their own lives. My old Bible college lecturer used to say that most people can't find God for the same reason that burglars can't find policemen. They're heading in the wrong direction. Because they know that if they acknowledge God, then they will have to acknowledge the fact that their lives must be lived in a certain way, and that God will hold them accountable for not living their lives in a certain way. So that's the word. It's the word that's translated like in the New King James, or approve in Young's, is adokimadzo. To document, dokimadzo means to check it and to approve it. Adokimadzo means that you don't give your approval to it. It doesn't. You don't pass it. And then the next one, where it says God gave them up to a debased mind, that's linked to the same word. That is adokimos. And what it's really saying is that there's been a kind of a poetic judgment in God's sentence. That is to say, the human race, particularly the heathen nations, that they rejected God, and God rejected their thinking processes. They did not approve of God. God gave them over to a mind that had failed the test, if you like, substandard, seconds mind, a mind that does not have the stamp of God on it in the way that it originally did. If you turn way back into the Old Testament, to Jeremiah chapter 6 and verse 30, you'll see that this is not a new idea. Jeremiah chapter 6 and verse 30. He refers to certain people as, people will call them rejected silver. I think the old King James Version said reprobate silver. People will call them reprobate silver because the Lord has rejected them. Because they haven't passed the test. They have not got God's stamp upon them. So it's this same kind of powerful picture that's coming through there. Now, there are consequences to all this, as we shall see in just a moment. There's a verse, I couldn't find this, but I got somebody to find it for me. If you turn to Psalm 135, you'll find this little phrase. In fact, this is repeated in one of the other Psalms as well, but this is Psalm 135, verses 15 to 17, and he talks about idolatry. And he says this, verse 15, "The idols of the nation are silver and gold, the work of men's hands. They have mouths, but they do not speak. Eyes they have, but they do not see. They have ears, but they do not hear, nor is there any breath in their mouth. Those who make them are like them. So is everyone who trusts in them." It's a very sobering thing that we do generally become more like the thing that we worship. The thing that we think is the most important, the thing that is our greatest idol. We tend to kind of gravitate towards that way of behavior. And you'll see the consequences, because when people began to imagine God as a human being and began to imagine God behaving like a human being with all the sexual immorality that was all around them and all the bestial activity, behaving like beasts that you see in the world around you, it began to have an effect upon men and women themselves. And you'll see Paul makes that connection here. Those who make them are like them. As to say, those who make those idols, those statues, become like them. So is everyone who trusts in them. I want to say something about homosexuality, because Paul has something to say in these verses, and we mustn't avoid them when we're doing this kind of thing. Paul says in the verses that follow now that homosexuality is the direct result of idolatry. He said it's because people, and idolatry is the direct result of rejecting the light that they had. So when people reject the light of God, they don't just kind of move into a no man's land, or always, inevitably, there will be a consequence. When God reveals truth to you, your response to it will determine what happens next. You will either draw nearer to him if you believe what he has said and you obey him, or you will draw farther from him if you deny what he's saying to you. So it is a direct result of idolatry. I don't mean in a particular homosexual person. I don't mean your neighbour. I don't mean that someone may be that you work with. But the fact of homosexuality, the practice of homosexuality, is a direct result, says Paul, of idolatry. He actually says that homosexuality is against nature. It's unnatural. He also says it's shameful. It occurs to me that the time may come when we could end up in prison for saying these kind of things. But here it is plainly in Romans chapter 1, that this kind of behaviour is a direct result of men rejecting light and going off in their own directions. But not only homosexuality, these other things have come as a result of man's rejection of the light. He says, being filled with all unrighteousness. Let me read that whole passage so that we see the connection. Romans chapter 1, You see, in verse 23, he's talking about changing the glory of the incorruptible God into an image, that's his idolatry, made like to corruptible man and birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. Therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness in the lusts of their heart, to dishonour their own bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error, which was due. And then it comes on to this verse that we looked at. And even as they refused to recognize the light that God was giving to them, refused to put their stamp. Do you remember that Jesus once used this language, and he said that that people who received his testimony put their seal to it that God was true. You hear the truth and you put your amen to it. You put your name to it. You say, yes, I agree with this witness. If you see the witness and you know it's true and you refuse to put your seal to it, then you are heading into a deeper, deeper darkness. Even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting. Being filled, it makes me sigh and kind of sobers me to think that mankind was always designed to be filled. He will be filled with one thing or another. Being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. They won't approve of God, but they will approve of people who are disobeying God. It's a really very, very, very sobering end to this chapter. And then if we trickle just very briefly into the next chapter, you'll find this repetition of this idea. We shall need it the next time we're together. Therefore you are without defense, O man, whoever you are who judges. For in whatever you judge another, you condemn yourself, for you who judge practice the same things. So Paul is saying that not only have men refused to approve what they knew to be true by putting their seal to it and acknowledging the truth of God, but they've actually approved and put their seal to it and put their amen to people who are living a life that they know is not approved of God. And that actually the language he uses here is knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. So this is a pretty devastating accusation that Paul brings into this court of law. He brings it against the nations, and you can see the big theme throughout all this is really idolatry, which is why I keep on talking about the heathen. It's people who, I think it was G.K. Chesterton who once said something like this, that the concern is that when people reject the Bible, the concern isn't that people will not believe anything, but the real concern is that they will believe anything. They believe anything that they want to believe. And all that comes from that initial rejection of something that they knew to be true originally. So I'm going to stop there so that we can kind of give more attention in a proper way to the other one. So if you've got any questions, ask, and we'll see how we get on with them. Go on, what's your question?
I slightly lost you with your terms of verdict and sentence and condemnation. Could you just...
Yes, okay. If you can imagine a flow chart, and actually when these notes are done there will be a flow chart here so you can follow it. So it starts off with the first thing that they're in a Roman court. The thing that kicked off the process was that there was an accusation. Someone brought an accusation to the authorities that someone had behaved in a way that was illegal. Then the accuser and the accused would have to come to the court where the judge would sit in judgment on the facts. He would sift the evidence and decide which he felt was right and who was speaking the truth. That part of it is the judgment, and that's the Greek word krino. And it's linked. It just simply means it's a kind of a judicial judging of something. If the judge then found that the person who had been accused was guilty, you move into something which is called the katakrino, which is translated in our Bibles very often as condemnation. It certainly is in Romans, translated condemnation. What I was saying is that the problem is that sometimes, particularly in, I think in John chapter 3 or something like that, and maybe a little bit later on in John, the word krino, which really means judged, is actually translated as katakrino, condemned. And it's wrong, and it really throws the whole thing out. It makes it very confusing is actually what's being said. So you start off point 1 with the accusation. Then there is the trial, there is the judging process, the judgment, if you like. And we tend to use judgment meaning a kind of a bad judgment, but the judgment process could sometimes acquit a person, and that person could be set free. So the judging is an essential part. So that's the krino part. But when you get to the decision, if the judge says guilty, then the two ways split. For the person that the judge has sent is guilty, the next part in the process is he pronounces the sentence. This is what this court judges, that you shall pay a fine, or you'll be flogged, or you'll be put to death, or whatever it is. And then finally, there would be the execution. I don't just mean kind of death, but I mean the carrying out of the sentence. So from the moment the person has been judged guilty, the next part of the process is the condemnation, which is the issuing of the sentence from the judge, who says the price for what you have done is this, and then the exacting of that price, the demanding of that is condemnation. If the judge sifts the evidence and decides that it's not proven, and that this man is the case is not carried in that sense, he declares that person just before the law. As far as the law is concerned, that person is without that crime, is without that, he hasn't transgressed as far as the law is concerned. It's not saying he's a nice man. It doesn't say he's nice to his wife or to the dog or anything like that. It's just simply saying, concerning this crime with which you've been accused, the law finds it unproven and you are just. You walk from the court without a blemish on your character. There's no effect of it, there's no record of it, you're absolutely free. Paul will work this out as we go farther on into Romans, and you remember famously he'll say in kind of Romans chapter 5, therefore there is no condemnation. Sorry, Romans chapter 8, isn't it? Therefore there is no condemnation to them that are in Christ Jesus. And what he's saying is that if a person is put in Christ, and we're running ahead of Romans now, but if a person puts their faith in Christ's death, God pronounces that person to be right with him. If you like, right in terms of the law. Actually, not because he hasn't done it, but because the penalty has already been paid. So that's the pattern of it. And so that person then is declared just and will walk from the court a free man. It's this, the Papua New Guinea people who use pidgin English were given a translation of the Bible, and when they were trying to work out some idea of justification by faith and explain this to the people and then use this pidgin English, they came up with this phrase, which I think is brilliant. They said, God, him say, me okay. The judge, him say, me okay. Now, in a Roman court of law, it might be, of course, that the person had actually committed the crime, but the judge doesn't find it proven, so he will acquit him. And he isn't saying he is pure and spotless. He's just saying the law cannot brand you a criminal. We can't do this in this particular instance. So you are free to go from the court as a free man. And that would happen now. I mean, I'm sure that a fair number of people in kind of our Western societies who are tried for things and the police can't prove their case, or they have good lawyers or something like that, and the case isn't carried, and in that case they walk from the court a free man without any blemish on their character. And it may be that he knows he's done it, and the judge knows he's done it, and everybody knows he's done it, but actually it can't be proved that he's done it, so he's actually declared just, righteous in terms of the law. And this language, I didn't say this as we were kind of talking, but this is a bit of a generalization, but you could almost say that the Greeks gave us our language for philosophy, the way that we think and we process ideas. The Jews gave us our language for religion, kind of words of worship and praise and this kind of thing. The Romans gave us our language for law. And Roman law has prevailed throughout the Western world, of course, ever since. And Paul, of course, is writing to the Romans. So if Paul writes to the Romans and talks about the law, unless he is specific, we always need to keep in mind that he may be talking about the Roman pattern of law and not necessarily the Sinai pattern of law. In fact, there are similarities because under the Sinai law, I think it's in Deuteronomy, it was said quite specifically that a judge must not justify a guilty man, and that he must not condemn an innocent man. So that kind of pattern is still there. But the law, the Romans systematized it. I mean, all of our law has been systematized by the Romans. So that's that kind of pattern, and it's a very strong, what I would call a kind of a controlling model that goes through this first part of Romans. And it's interesting that Paul kind of uses it in a sense against the heathen to begin with, because he's found them guilty. As far as he's concerned, God has found them guilty, and God has actually carried out his sentence. And his sentence is that they no longer think in the way that they should think. They are now the slaves of their passions. These are the things that have kind of happened as a result of these sort of things. And he will then go on later on. We'll be talking about justification by faith and propitiation, all these big kind of ideas and words. But there's a wonderful kind of weaving together of these things. And part of the reason I'm actually saying this and saying it so clearly, or trying to say it so clearly, is that there is a movement at the present time among some evangelicals, some in America and some in this country, and some very high-profile evangelicals in this country, who are preaching what they call the new perspective. People like N.T. Wright Tom Wright, who is a very highly respected evangelical theologian, has adopted this particular line. And their line is that they don't like the language of substitutionary penal atonement. Famously, there was another man, also a very high-profile evangelical, who said if the Father punished Christ for our sins, that is cosmic child abuse. That's what he called it. And actually that book the foreword was written by N.T. Wright. And N.T. Wright wouldn't say that. He's a much more careful theologian. N.T. Wright would say he does believe in the substitutionary penal atonement. But then he will do other things, and you see that he's uncomfortable with some of the language. For example, he's written that although he likes kind of Stuart Townend's songs very much, the one that has the line in it where it says, I've forgotten, the old English would have said, justice divine was satisfied.
I think I know the line you mean. There is one.
God's judgment was satisfied, or something like that. And N.T. Wright encourages everybody to change it to the love of God was satisfied. Because although...
The love of God was satisfied.
Yeah. I mean, the love of God was satisfied in one sense. But what he's doing is he is distancing himself from, I think, the crude version of what this other person called divine child abuse. But there are increasing numbers, actually, of evangelicals, particularly in certain denominations, who think Tom Wright can do no wrong. He's a very winsome writer. I don't know whether you've kind of come across any of his stuff, but he was the Bishop of Durham, and he's been a lecturer. He's written several books along this. He's right in the middle now of a series of books, and they call it the New Perspective. It started off in America, and has been taken up by people like Tom Wright. I think they're wrong, and I think the as part of the reason is why I said that I think it is significant that we have such a detail about Roman trials in the Gospels, in Luke, and again Luke here. And Luke, of course, is the companion of Paul, and it's Paul's theology fits perfectly if you have this Roman model of justification by faith that's kind of operating. There are other implications to what they call the New Perspective, but what they're really saying is, and they would say this, they think that the way that the Reformers presented their view of atonement was actually a reaction against the teaching of Thomas Aquinas and some other people in the Roman Catholic Church, and that consequently Reformation theology is a 16th century reaction, and that actually we're beyond that now, and we shouldn't kind of worry about that. And it's interesting that our present evangelicalish Archbishop of Canterbury is getting very cosy with the current Pope. They're talking about surprising ventures of unity and all kinds of interesting things. But that's going on the surface. That's why I'm trying to say this as clearly as I can. I'm pretty classical, reformed, like the reformers on this particular thing. I think there are different models for the atonement. There's the Christ victor model. There's the payment to the devil theory. There's all that sort of thing, and there's this other kind of model. They're not always mutually exclusive, these models, but certainly I think N.T. Wright is wrong. in what he's doing. I think he's overreacted to what he sees as a hard line of the reformers. He thinks that Paul is not really saying that the Jews had tried to establish their own righteousness, although Paul seems to say it pretty clearly. He doesn't think that's really true. He thinks that the history of the day shows that they also believed in grace, and that what Paul is fighting against is something that's called covenantal nomism. They must sit up at night thinking these kind of crazy titles. That simply means that you come into the covenant by grace, but you stay in the covenant by keeping the law. And that Paul is kind of chipping away at that, and that Paul really is chipping away at the external confirmations of the covenant. So he's chipping away at the Sabbath and circumcision and these things, and that it isn't as fundamental as the reformers have believed, that the Jewishness of that day were actually trying to use the law as a means of achieving righteousness, which Paul seems to say that pretty clearly to me, but that's not their view.